Stuart was a little bit frustrated in not being able to accomplish his primary goal that night. But fortune was smiling upon Stuart that night. Much to his pleasure, he discovered General Pope's headquarters baggage, all sitting there at Canton. Unfortunately, he was unable to capture General Pope because General Pope was out at Rappahannock Station, close to his front lines that night. But Stuart certainly managed to capture quite a few of Pope's staff officers. But the big prize was General Pope's dispatch book, which revealed the fact that Pope was now anticipating the arrival of reinforcements from McClellan's army in just a matter of days. This vital intelligence was brought back to General Lee, and it confirmed Lee's suspicions that Pope was now being reinforced, and that meant the window of opportunity to destroy Pope would soon close. Stuart's raid at Catlett Station also demonstrated that General Pope's line of supplies for the Orange and Alexandria Railroad was quite vulnerable. So armed with this intelligence, General Lee hatched a very bold and daring plan, one that defied conventional military wisdom. Despite the growing strength of General Pope's army, Lee would proceed to divide his forces again. On the morning of August 25th, he would send General Jackson with his left wing of the Army of Northern Virginia, along with Stuart's cavalry, numbering about 25,000 men altogether, on a wide flank march around General Pope's lines, which remained along the Rappahannock River. Now, Jackson's troops were already famous for some lightning-fast marches. They certainly lived up to their reputation as foot cavalry. They covered over 50 miles in 2 days. By sunset on August 26th, the head of Jackson's column finally reached Bristow Station, just 5 miles south of Manassas. After derailing a couple of Union supply trains at Bristow and causing other havoc there, Jackson sent 2 regiments of Isaac Trimble's brigade, along with Stuart's cavalry, up the tracks to Manassas Junction, where in the pre-dawn hours of August 27th, they took possession of a huge Union Army supply depot. After daybreak on the 27th, Jackson moved the bulk of his command up to Manassas, and for the remainder of that day, they proceeded to plunder all these Union supplies that General Pope had stockpiled there for his own army. Meanwhile, back down the tracks in the vicinity of Catlett Station, General Pope discovers that his telegraph lines have mysteriously gone dead in the middle of the night. His communications with Washington have now been severed, at least temporarily anyway. After sending out some cavalry to investigate the situation, Pope becomes aware that Jackson is the cause of all his woes up here at Manassas. Pope sees this as a tremendous opportunity. Jackson is isolated behind Union lines with an inferior force, and Pope is quite confident he can easily cut off Jackson's escape and destroy Jackson's entire command once and for all before the rest of Lee's army could render any aid. So on the morning of August 27th, while Jackson is plundering Union supplies here at Manassas Junction, General Pope orders his entire army to abandon their positions down along the Rappahannock River and begin converging in this direction in an effort to trap Jackson. Little did General Pope realize at the time, but he was doing everything that General Lee was hoping he would do. This whole maneuver by General Jackson behind Union lines was intended to try to draw Pope's army away from their strong defensive positions down along the Rappahannock. Lee's plan was working perfectly. And no sooner had General Pope turned his back on the Rappahannock, the rest of Lee's army, the troops under Longstreet, were already in motion, following much the same path that Jackson had taken to get around the Union lines. Everyone was now converging in this direction. General Pope finally arrived at Manassas Junction around noontime on August 28th. He found the place a smoking ruin. Jackson had vanished in the night and had torched everything that he could not carry off. Eventually, some of Jackson's stragglers were picked up on the road to Centerville, which is 5 miles off to our east. General Pope concluded that Jackson, with his entire command, was desperately trying to escape via Centerville. So on the afternoon of August 28th, General Pope orders his entire army now to change course. Instead of converging on Manassas, they're now directed to converge upon Centerville. And that brings us to our map behind me. Now, before I get too far, let me give you some orientation for the map. The visitor center, where you're situated now, is right here in this location on what we call Haley Hill. And just outside our driveway, you have the Manassas Southern Road running north and south, Manassas Junction being 5 miles that way. Just to our north, the Sudley Road intersects the Warrenton Turnpike, today Route 29, which runs east and west in this immediate vicinity. And if you follow the turnpike eastward, another 5 miles, you'll run into Centerville. If you go westward about another 5 miles, you'll end up at Gainesville. And to give you some idea of the scale on this map, it's about a mile between this intersection where the stone house is situated and the stone bridge down here over Bull Run. It's also about a mile between the stone house and this next intersection over here, which marks the site of a small community known as Groveton. Sometimes the Second Battle of Manassas is referred to by some of the veterans as the Battle of Groveton, because a lot of the fighting was actually centered in this general vicinity around this intersection. Now, it was very late in the afternoon on August 28th when a Union division under General Rufus King was seen marching eastward down here along the Warrenton Turnpike, heading towards Centerville. These troops had just received their new orders from General Pope to converge upon Centerville. The turnpike would certainly be the most expeditious way to get there. Now, King's division was organized into 4 brigades. Leading the column was a brigade of General John Hatch, followed by a brigade under John Gibbon. Abner Doubleday had 3 regiments in his small brigade following Gibbon. And then bringing up the rear of the column was a brigade under Marcina Patrick. Now, the leading brigade under General Hatch had already passed through this little crossroads here at Groveton, totally oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Somewhere up here north of the turnpike, a good half mile perhaps, was a lone horseman, very intently watching these Union troops marching eastward towards Centerville. And that horseman was none other than Stonewall Jackson himself. When Jackson left Manassas Junction the previous night, he split up his command. He sent his 3 divisions off on separate roads, which was primarily designed to expedite the evacuation of the junction. But only one of Jackson's divisions, the troops under General A.P. Hill, had actually gone all the way to Centerville. And upon reaching Centerville, A.P. Hill doubled back along the Warrenton Turnpike, recrossing Bull Run, and then moving northward to reunite with the rest of Jackson's command up here in this area here known as Stony Ridge. Stony Ridge was a little bit off the beaten path and somewhat secluded. It was really just on the fringes of the first Manassas battlefield. But Jackson felt this was a good place to rest his men while waiting for General Lee and General Longstreet to catch up. Stony Ridge would also prove to be a very strong defensive position. Just aside of Stony Ridge, represented by this line here that runs diagonally across the map, was an unfinished railroad grade. The Manassas Gap Railroad Company had started an independent line into Alexandria in the 1850s, so they didn't have to go through Manassas Junction and use the tracks of the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. But due to financial difficulties, they were unable to complete construction of this independent line, but they were able to at least complete most of the grade work, which left some lovely embankments, which offered Jackson's troops excellent cover and concealment, almost like ready-made fortifications. When Jackson was informed that there were Union troops down here on the turnpike late that afternoon, he had to ride out to check out the situation for himself. And after sizing up the strength of this one lone Union division, Jackson rode back to order out his men. Jackson was determined to attack this Union column, and by doing so, he would be revealing his position to General Pope. But that was calculated to try to draw Pope's army into battle on ground that now much better favored the Confederates. So it was right around 6 o'clock in the evening on August 28th when Confederate batteries deployed up here on the northern portion of the John Bronner Farm and began shelling these unsuspecting Union troops down here along the turnpike. Most of this artillery fire would fall upon the brigade of General John Gibbon, who was a fairly competent Union officer. He was considered somewhat of a renegade in the Union Army, and he probably spoke with a southern accent. He was raised in North Carolina. In fact, he had 3 brothers fighting in the Confederate Army. But Gibbon had attended West Point, class of 1847, graduating just 1 year after Thomas Jackson. And like Jackson, Gibbon became an artillery officer and a very competent one. He was initially put in command of Battery B of the 4th U.S. Artillery, but he only commanded that battery up until November of 1861, at which time he received a promotion to major, and then was made chief of artillery in the Army Corps commanded by General Irvin McDowell. He remained McDowell's chief of artillery up until early May of 1862, at which time Gibbon received another promotion, this time to Brigadier General of Volunteers. And now he was put in command of the whole brigade of infantry, 4 regiments, which all happened to be Western troops. The 19th Indiana, 2nd Wisconsin, 6th Wisconsin, and 7th Wisconsin. Now, with the exception of the 2nd Wisconsin, which had seen combat here at 1st Manassas, the other regiments of the brigade were still pretty green and still in need of quite a bit of drill. And being regular Army, Gibbon was just the right man to give them all that drill. Gibbon drilled these troops incessantly from dawn to dusk, and consequently was not a very popular commanding officer. But the drill and discipline that Gibbon instilled in these troops would ultimately pay dividends here on the Bonner Farm on the evening of August 28th. Now, Gibbon, when his troops came under all this artillery fire, initially thought it was just Confederate horse artillery harassing his column. All his information suggested that Jackson was somewhere in the vicinity of Centerville. So Gibbon decided to go after these Confederate batteries with his most experienced regiment, the 2nd Wisconsin. He led the 2nd Wisconsin up through these woods here, which offered a covered approach to the Confederate position. Once the 2nd Wisconsin cleared the wood line, they formed a line of battle. He threw forward 2 companies for skirmishing, and as those companies got up to the top of this ridge, they got a rather rude surprise. Instead of finding just a couple of batteries of Confederate artillery, there was a massive line of Confederate infantry coming at them. And this was not just any old Confederate infantry. It was the most veteran troops that Jackson had, the famed Stonewall Brigade. Now, it is worthy to note at this point in time, late August of 1862, the 5 Virginia regiments that comprised the Stonewall Brigade are now down to a collective strength of only 850 men. At 1st Manassas, they numbered some 2,500 men. But the first year of war certainly took its toll. But still, those 850 men of the Stonewall Brigade far outnumbered the 430 men of the 2nd Wisconsin. And General Gibbon now realized the 2nd Wisconsin was in big trouble over here with the Stonewall Brigade coming at them and about to envelop their flanks. So Gibbon had to rush back to the turnpike and bring up his other 3 regiments. The 19th Indiana would eventually move up to the left flank of the 2nd Wisconsin, with their left flank near the Bonner Farmhouse over here, while the 7th Wisconsin would form to the right flank of the 2nd Wisconsin over in this area here, while the 6th Wisconsin would deploy even further to the right on the neighboring Lucinda Dogan Farm over here. There was a significant gap between the 7th Wisconsin and 6th Wisconsin, and eventually 2 regiments of Abner Doubleday's brigade would fill that void. So a total of 6 Union regiments would occupy a line stretching nearly a half a mile between the Bonner Farmhouse here and the Dogan Farm over here. And those 6 Union regiments would now find themselves confronted by even more Confederates. Not far behind the Stonewall Brigade came a Georgia Brigade under Alexander Lawton. Isaac Trimble's brigade would move in and gang up against the 6th Wisconsin over here on the Dogan Farm, while Alexander Tolliver's Confederate brigade would gang up against the 19th Indiana over here by the Bonner Farmhouse. The fighting became very intense, very quickly. But you also have to understand, it was getting dark. The first Confederate artillery shells came flying right around 6 o'clock, and by the time the 2nd Wisconsin got up here to find themselves confronted by the Stonewall Brigade, it was closer to 6:30. About the same time, the sun was setting off to the west. By the time the other Union regiments got into line, it was after 7 o'clock, and it was definitely getting dark. Battle lines were less than 100 yards apart, and that range, you really didn't need to use your sights on your muskets very well. You wouldn't be able to use the sights anyway in dimming, fading daylight. But it became a very vicious firefight. In his memoirs, written after the war, General Gibbon would say it was the most intense musketry fire that he had ever listened to that rolled along these 2 lines of battle. That's a remarkable statement coming from this officer who later saw fighting at places like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Spotsylvania Courthouse. Mm-hmm. The fighting continued unabated for a good hour and a half. until about 8 o'clock that evening. By that time, it was totally dark. You could not tell friend from foe in the darkness. So the fighting broke off. Jackson was very frustrated that he could not overwhelm these 6 Union regiments, which stood their ground quite valiantly. Jackson had numerical advantage, of course, but he was unable to exploit that advantage because of the growing darkness, adding confusion to the situation, and the fact that he was losing a good number of his most trusted officers. He lost 2 division commanders that night, William Tolliver and Richard Ewell, both very seriously wounded. Without the division commanders, there was no coordination among the brigades in those divisions. And there was very little coordination within the regiments within those brigades. So Jackson was definitely frustrated that he could not overwhelm these 6 Union regiments. But he was ultimately successful in achieving his primary goal. Later that night, General Pope would learn of the action over here on the Garner Farm and would immediately order his entire army now to concentrate on the old battlefield of Bull Run, fully confident he now had Jackson trapped, little realizing he was walking into one. The following morning, August 29th, Jackson had pulled his troops back to the unfinished railroad, and his line would extend a good 1.5 miles from the Garner Farm all the way up to nearly Southern Church in this area here. The Union troops that had been fighting here also fell back to the turnpike, and then overnight they moved further southward, trying to find the rest of Pope's army. They didn't want to remain in the vicinity of Groveton, knowing that Jackson was here in full force. But other Union troops would arrive the following morning, and as they arrived, they would be directed to probe Jackson's positions off here along the unfinished railroad. A series of attacks would be made against Jackson's position at different points. Most of these attacks would be hurled back with heavy losses. Only on a couple of occasions did the Union lines manage to penetrate the Confederate lines. They were quickly expelled. But General Pope only envisioned these attacks along the unfinished railroad to be a holding action, to keep Jackson's troops occupied, while a much stronger flank attack could be delivered from the west, from the direction of Gainesville. This flank attack was assigned to the 5th Army Corps under Major General Fitzjohn Porter. These were troops that had previously been part of McClellan's army, and they just had arrived on the morning of the 29th to join Pope. Porter's troops came up along the railroad to Manassas Junction, and as soon as they reached Manassas Junction, General Pope sent them orders to now proceed in the direction of Gainesville, which is off to our west, a little bit off our map. Pope's idea was to try to get on Jackson's right flank and rear, preventing Jackson any opportunity to escape. So Fitzjohn Porter put his troops in motion up the Manassas-Gainesville Road, which runs off here to our southwest. They got maybe 3.5 miles outside of Manassas Junction, about halfway between Manassas and Gainesville, to a point about where I'm standing now. And they came to a little stream called Dawkins Branch. Not a very big stream, you could easily jump across it. Right along Dawkins Branch, they encountered some rather stiff resistance from a line of Confederate skirmishers. Fitzjohn Porter had to halt his column and deploy his own skirmish line, and there was a rather lively skirmish going on down here, some 3 miles to our southwest, well isolated from the rest of the fighting up here along the unfinished railroad. While the skirmishing continued down here along Dawkins Branch, Fitzjohn Porter had a pretty good view off to the west. You could see some heavy dust clouds in that direction, which certainly suggested a strong presence of Confederate troops in his front. Actually, most of those dust clouds were being kicked up by Jeb Stuart's cavalry, dragging brush along the road to make it seem like there were a lot more Confederate troops in front of Fitzjohn Porter than there actually were. But Porter was also a recipient of some intelligence offered by General John Buford, a newly appointed Union cavalry commander who would later gain much more fame at Gettysburg. But Buford had actually witnessed several Confederate brigades passing through Gainesville earlier that morning. And this was relayed to Fitzjohn Porter. And it became all too evident to Fitzjohn Porter that he was now being confronted by elements of General Longstreet's command. And Porter would have known that Longstreet had some 25,000 to 30,000 men, a force well over 4 times the size of Porter's command. Consequently, Porter was not about to get too aggressive, knowing that there was this massive amount of Confederates in his front. and especially given that he was in a very isolated position with no other Union troops to support him. He at least held his position down here along Dawkins Branch. But throughout the afternoon on August 29th, General Pope, who finally arrived on the battlefield and made his headquarters over here on the hill behind Stonehouse, was anxiously awaiting a massive attack to be delivered on Jackson's right flank over here. And for reasons unknown to General Pope, it was not happening. Pope was totally oblivious to the fact that Longstreet's troops were arriving on the battlefield that day. In fact, Pope had every reason to believe that Longstreet was still a day's march away. In his arrogance, General Pope simply refused to believe any evidence to the contrary. Longstreet contributed somewhat to Pope's perceptions because Longstreet did not immediately make his presence known on the battlefield. The main part of Longstreet's command would come in along the Warrenton Turnpike, heading towards Groveton, but before they reached Groveton, they halted along this wood line here. Longstreet was not willing to commit his troops into the fighting here at Groveton, knowing that there was a massive number of Union troops down here at Dawkins Branch off his right flank. Those Union troops might have given his right flank a little bit of grief. So Longstreet convinced General Lee that it might be prudent to wait until they figure out what Fitzjohn Porter was going to do before making any moves here at Groveton. So Lee went along with that, and so Longstreet kept most of his troops well concealed in these woods, and his line extended a good mile south of the Warrenton Turnpike, with only a few brigades actually facing Fitzjohn Porter down here. Well, anyway, as the afternoon wore on, Pope became more and more impatient for this attack to be delivered on Jackson's right flank. So around 4:30 in the afternoon, General Pope sends out a new order to Fitzjohn Porter. This one reads, "Your line of march brings you on the enemy's right flank and rear. Attack immediately." Now, of course, at the time, Pope is not really sure where Fitzjohn Porter is actually situated, nor is the courier carrying this order. And the courier does proceed to get lost and doesn't find Porter until about 6:30 that evening, just about the same time the sun is setting off to the west. Well, Porter, still believing that he's being confronted by the better part of Longstreet's command and not seeing any other Union troops to support him, is not about to make a night attack. And so the attack is not made. That'll ultimately get Porter into some hot water. He'll be brought up later on court-martial charges for deliberate disobedience of a direct order. Well, anyway, after dark, General Pope is totally frustrated that his plans to destroy Jackson are going to not follow through. But anyway, he sends another direct order to Fitzjohn Porter, this one rather tersely worded. This one reads, "Upon receipt of this order, which you will acknowledge immediately, you will march with your entire command and report directly to my headquarters," again over here, "first thing in the morning on August 30th. So he sends the courier off with this message, and again, the courier has trouble finding Porter in the darkness, but ultimately, sometime after midnight, Porter does receive these orders and immediately puts his troops in motion to follow those orders. But Porter down here at Dawkins Branch does not have any direct way to get over to General Pope's headquarters. There's no direct roads, there's a lot of woods, and very likely a lot of Confederates between him and General Pope. So the only practical way for Porter to get to General Pope is to march all the way back to Manassas Junction and then find a southerly road, which will then take them directly northward to the Stonehouse and General Pope's headquarters, which is the route that he takes. Porter will arrive at General Pope's headquarters first thing in the morning on August 30th, as directed. Now, on the morning of the 30th, General Pope is still somewhat optimistic, despite the previous day's frustrations. In fact, early that morning, in the pre-dawn hours, Confederate troops were observed marching westward along the Warrenton Turnpike towards Gainesville. And General Pope interpreted this as evidence of a Confederate withdrawal. And if the Confederates were inclined to retreat, then General Pope was inclined to remain on the offensive. What was actually observed, however, was Richard Anderson's division of General Longstreet's command. Anderson's troops had arrived in the middle of the night. It was a dark night, and in the total darkness, they had passed beyond Longstreet's position over here then continued through Groveton and almost to within spitting distance of the Union positions. But early in the morning, before it got too late, General Anderson realized his location was far too close to the Union positions, so he quickly countermarched his entire command back through Groveton to get behind the rest of Longstreet's line over here. And in so doing, managed to confuse General Pope, quite unintentionally. Well, when Fitzjohn Porter arrives on the field, he will be given an opportunity to redeem himself for the previous day's inaction. Instead of attacking Jackson's right flank over here from the west, he's now going to have to do it from the east. Now, you can't move 6,000 Union troops from point A to point B all in one instance. They're going to be strung out along the roads some 5 miles. So it will take most of the morning and part of the afternoon for Fitzjohn Porter to get all his troops onto the battlefield. He would concentrate them here in this area, which is somewhat protected by this patch of woods here known as the Groveton Woods. The attack will be launched right around mid-afternoon, 3 o'clock. And this would prove to be the largest Union attack of the battle. While all the previous attacks being made against Jackson's position were made with individual brigades in a rather piecemeal fashion, now Fitzjohn Porter would mass at least 4 brigades against Jackson's line over here on the side of the field, on the Dogan farm. It had some prospect of success. But as soon as these Union troops began pouring out of the Groveton Woods into the open meadows of Lucinda Dogan's farm, they became a very inviting target for Jackson's infantry, positioned up here along the unfinished railroad, which began pouring heavy volumes of small arms fire into these massive Union lines. And also over here on the Dogan farm, there was a massive concentration of Confederate artillery. 2 whole battalions of Confederate artillery. A total of 36 pieces of artillery altogether. These Confederate guns had a perfect field of fire. They could reach out and touch anything that moved this side of the Groveton Woods. And they certainly took advantage of the situation. Lead and iron was raining down upon these Union troops the minute they came out of these woods. And the Union lines were thinned considerably as they advanced over this 500 yards of open ground. By the time they got close enough to Jackson's position, they were simply not strong enough to overrun the position. Jackson's troops, however, have been firing their muskets at a very sustained rate, 2 rounds per minute, and within 20 minutes, many of Jackson's men had expended the 40 rounds of ammunition they carried in their cartridge boxes. In desperation, the Confederates began hurling rocks from the railroad grade at these Union troops that were now within stone's throw. But I don't want to give you the impression that the rocks ultimately repulsed this Union attack. Much of the credit belongs to the Confederate artillery over here on the Broader Farm. They were pouring so much lead and iron into these Union lines, thinning the Union ranks to such a degree that the Union lines simply were not strong enough to overwhelm Jackson's position. Still, by 3:30 that afternoon, Jackson was getting a little bit nervous. His line was beginning to waver. His troops were beginning to run out of ammunition. So Jackson had to call for help. He had a signal station up here on Stony Ridge which could communicate very readily with General Lee's headquarters over here on what was then called Monroe's Hill. So right around 3:30 that afternoon, General Lee, General Longstreet over here received this plea for help from General Jackson. And General Longstreet feels the most expedient way to come to Jackson's aid would be to throw more artillery into the equation. Longstreet found another battery attached to his command, the Dixie Artillery, a Virginia battery under the command of Captain William Chapman. And Longstreet deployed Chapman's 4 guns right over here on a little knoll just north of the turnpike. It's stop number 2 on our driving tour. We'll want to check it out later. And from this position, Chapman's guns could fire into the flank as well as the rear of these Union lines that were pressing Jackson's position. This had almost an immediate effect. Union troops quickly broke off their attack and quickly began racing back